Lahey. Tiene más de 30 años de experiencia en el desempeño de evaluaciones de gestión y en la medición de evaluaciones en el sector público y en unidades de evaluación corporativa en Canadá. Fue el creador de la Junta de Tesorería del Centro de Excelencia de Evaluación y responsable, al inicio de la década de 2000, de supervisar la reconstrucción y el reposicionamiento de la función evaluativa en el Servicio Público Federal canadiense. Desde 2004, y a través de su propia empresa REL Solutions, ha asesorado a organizaciones de varios países sobre el desarrollo y la implementación de capacidades de evaluación y monitoreo, basadas en resultados.
In Canada, there's a long history for monitoring and evaluation, and in particular evaluation. It goes back more than 30 years. And the original drivers had to do with really a philosophy in the federal government. What it meant was they also had to be held accountable for delivery on. The term results wasn't being used at that time, but in effect in today's world to deliver on results. So where there are something like 90 heads of departments in the federal government, and these are the people who are held accountable. So in order for them to, in effect, be able to manage and also to be held accountable, there needed to be some forms of instruments to gather information. In the 1990s, there was an increased desire to have our elected officials become more engaged in terms of governance and transparency of public sector discussions. And when I say elected officials, it was also the notion of reporting to Canadians. Fast forward over to the 2000s, the framework that the government has used as their management framework is called Results for Canadians. But it puts it in a more cohesive environment to ensure that as we carry out functions in government, we're spending our money wisely. So all of those elements fall and cascade under this broad framework called Results for Canadians. And the key tools to help get there are performance monitoring, evaluation, and audit is another function. In reality, one of the challenges that we have faced in Canada is to really try and ensure that elected officials are interested in this. And it's not that they're not interested in good governance, it's that in the busy world, providing reports, monitoring and evaluation reports and information isn't always top priority. And so one of the challenges has been to provide information in a way that's going to be easily digested by elected officials. But they are a key stakeholder, and they've reflected as a key stakeholder on the demand side. Another key stakeholder on the demand side is the central agency. They establish the roles for monitoring and evaluation. They set the requirements for individual departments and for the system in general. And they serve really as the interface between the departments who are providing this information and the Treasury Board itself. Demand side in terms of stakeholders, the deputy head of individual departments and agencies. They're the ones who are accountable, and they're providing the information upwards, but they are demanding it then from their technical experts and their managers within their realm. We have them at the departmental level, we have them at the central agency, at that legislative level as well. Well, they're important, I think, for all of those objectives that I mentioned under the broad Results for Canadians, to ensure that there is transparency across government, there's accountability, that there's good governance, that there is a learning, and there's value for money in the expenditure of public sector funds. So all of those players are key players in the public service or as elected officials. So they're all relevant to these issues. One of the things in terms of the role they play in influencing the demand is that they are different audiences at different levels. The parliamentary committees may be looking at such issues as government operations. So that's a level of demand that filters down through the central agency into the departments and into the bowels and depths of the departments in order to be able to respond to that, those kinds of questions, all the way down through the systems. So information is in effect, it's filtering up. And there are different users along the way. The deputy minister who, as I said, let the managers manage, but they are being held accountable to the central agency and ultimately to the elected officials as well. Because if they're not performing well, and worst case scenario, if in fact things are going terribly wrong, then in a very transparent environment, which this is, it will become known. As I mentioned, there's a long history of evaluation. In a more formal context, the performance measurement reporting, results orientation. The evaluation has been there, as I mentioned, over 30 years. There was a formal policy put in place with standards, directives from the central agency. There was also, and it's actually, I think, a key element of the Canadian model, is a policy center. And I think that's another feature of the model and the evaluation side of things. We have administrative policies that are actually fairly easy to change. Evaluation has been really quite a thriving function in the federal Canadian model. But part of it is a whole set of formal requirements that have been built in. And the formal requirements, there are policies. What they have done is they've introduced a requirement for every department to set up a performance measurement framework that links the broad objectives of that department. Another key tool or element associated with that reporting and the measurement reporting is each department has a formal requirement, and this is all 90 of them, to produce a report on plans and priorities in the spring of every year that gets tabled in Parliament, and that's a forward-looking document. In the fall of every year, there's a departmental performance report, which is looking back. That's also tabled in Parliament. The structure and the reporting reference point all relate back to this corporate performance framework. Probably the typical size of evaluation units in government is somewhere between 2 and 10 people. In the context of the performance monitoring, it's more difficult to estimate because what happens is that the program managers are responsible for monitoring their own programs. So they have to build this in as part of their job, to build that into the culture, to monitor as opposed to carry out and affect the program. There has to be a real desire at all levels. That orientation really requires, I'm flipping now to something else, but in terms of capacity building, a unit of about 10 professionals and a budget that represents the Center of Excellence for Evaluation, but I think is important. And that's something that was introduced in 2003. And it's a mechanism to try and help ensure that the system, the demand and supply side are working together. And what the math is, it's like a report card on a department. One of those broad dimensions is all about M&E and how M&E is used within the department. Like all of these tools, the first cut at them is less than perfect. And I would say for the system in general, after 35 years, we're still working to make it better. But I would suggest, having done a lot of international work, every country is working at trying to make it better. In the case of Canada, part of the role of the Center of Excellence for Evaluation is to be a champion and an advocate. They play other roles as well. Senior officials reflect often those short interests. And I'm not a believer in the Big Bang Theory that by throwing in a lot of money and imposing requirements on the whole system, you then walk away and assume that it's going to work. What I would do is talk about types of evaluation, because there's a lot of evaluation work that goes on. There's evaluations of individual programs. A lot of the focus has been on program improvement. I would say we've had probably an uneven experience in terms of how well policy evaluation works. We have had some good success, and part of it comes through carrying out some higher level or even cross-departmental evaluation work. We have introduced strategic or horizontal performance frameworks built around particular subject areas, monitor performance of programs that are feeding in to higher order objectives, but they can serve as the basis for evaluation of whether or not these broader objectives are being achieved. There are higher level kinds of reviews, and more recently, over the last couple of years, these have been called strategic reviews. But what has become clear over the last 2 years is that the programs of evaluation and the ongoing monitoring are serving as actually a key to help inform those strategic reviews. And it links to budgeting. There has been a formal requirement since 2000. The ultimate objective will still only be helping inform budget decisions. Evaluation and monitoring information isn't going to make those decisions. It will help inform. I think in terms of innovations, a number of the tools that I've mentioned, I think have been innovative. The concept of the performance measurement framework, we rolled it out, and we used to call it, up until we called it, a results-based management and accountability framework. And what that did, it served as the basis for bringing the technical specialists and the program managers together. And that common point was, on a program level, to clarify program objectives so that they could be articulated in the way they could be measured. So much of all of what we're talking about is based around the logic model. But we did have some success. And the system became a whole lot smarter in terms of understanding. Those 10 components that I mentioned all have indicators, and they all have a wealth of information. Some of the underpinnings recognize the importance of civil society. It's described that way. And so it becomes, in terms of the thinking of public servants, there are a number of other elements that I think have brought civil society close to all of this. And on a broad scale, I mentioned the Auditor General reports. Journalists, over the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years, recognize increasingly the wealth of information, information that is derived. It requires a political will to allow objective information. Civil society gets involved in evaluations of programs, and if they're not in there as a key part of the knowledge that's being drawn upon, individual cases may not be spotted. In terms of the technical specialist, and so much about carrying out a useful and effective evaluation, we're going through a transformation, but have less thought about the communication skills. Policy is doing is it's trying to raise the level of, in effect, qualification. It can actually be a low-cost approach to training and development. The American has the American Evaluation Association. In Canada, the way we have tended to operate over the 30 years that we've had such a society is there's a national association, and as the technology has changed, it's so easy to access information from around the world. Lessons learned, this is a long-term M&E. I think it's important to have a policy center. Brings back the notion that flexibility in the system and the way people think, and the importance of managing expectations. I think probably the biggest challenge with all of this is is moving organizations to what I would call a results culture. In the context of M&E, we haven't forgotten the E. We've put an awful lot of effort on the M, but we have continued to put effort and investment in the E. I hear people talk about what's going on in their country. If I didn't know, it would sound to me like they have systems that are working very well. I don't believe it because I know what we have lived through in 30+ years in Canada. We've got to move beyond that. And in moving beyond that, we have to admit that it's not perfect.